This is a lecture on characters, and characters can be constructed a lot of different ways. First and foremost, you need to know that characters are essential to a story. If a reader is not invested in the characters, doesn't love them or hate them, or ideally actually more than that, but both, then your character is not going to be very invested in the outcome of the story. As I've told you before, for a reader to sympathize or empathize with a protagonist is essential to the reader connecting with the conflict of the story. Now, there's a lot to say about characters, and I'm going to begin with a brief discussion of an article called You and Your Characters by James Patrick Kelly. There's a web link on your site that you can click on. You should have read this article before you go any further with the lecture that I'm presenting now. But essentially, the article begins by saying there's an awful lot to learn about characters. There are definitions that it goes through that I'm going to go through as well. And Mr. Kelly advises very well, and right properly, that you need to know all of these definitions, but that will not make you a good writer. In fact, better that the sooner you remember them, the sooner you forget them, and that once they have come to the unconscious mind, once you are no longer thinking about how to construct your characters, but rather knowing and have internalized the techniques and the definitions, then it will be more effective for you. This is similar to what I said about poetry early in the semester, that all the rules I would throw at you and all of the principles and methods of writing would interfere with your work for quite some time, and that's true. Hopefully, as you became less aware and conscious of the tools at your disposal and learned how to use them without thinking about using them, your writing improved. Same is so for characters. One easy way to begin is by pretending that every character is you, unless, of course, you have an inclination for wearing straw hats, in which case you know that every character can't be you. And in such a case, you might consider creating characters out of the people you know, your acquaintances, your friends, your co-workers, etc., realizing, of course, that you can't really capture who they are entirely, but they act as great starting points. Now, a good character is going to be more than just the hats he wears. A good character is constructed based on his or her motivations, her ideals, what causes them to progress or to make the decisions they make. A bad character, on the other hand, is one that is more in tune with progressing the story. What I mean by that is, if you have a character that's inserted in the story with the sole purpose of conveying information, dumping information, being a translator for weak narrative technique, then your character is going to be weak as well. And while, of course, there is a need for stock characters and flat characters, and I'll define these momentarily, you've got to understand that you want to maximize the essential characters and the complex characters in your story and minimize the use of those characters that are serving other purposes than being involved in the action of the story. Now, in order for you to really know your characters, especially if they're based on you, you've really got to know yourself. And self-examination is not easy, nor is it always comfortable. But the truth is that great characters are just like us, and they are good and they are bad as we are. And part of what we need to do is acknowledge that we have good sides and bad sides, that we're not just good old church-going folks, but sometimes, let's say, guys, we see a pretty woman in front of us at church, and the sermon's kind of dull. I know, it's a sin. But nonetheless, you get the idea. We all have good and bad in us, and to pretend otherwise wouldn't be being true to characters. It wouldn't be being true to self. So you want to construct characters that are multifaceted, at least the primary characters in your story, the 2, 3, 4, 5, however many there might be, that you can say you want your readers to be invested in. You want them to love them and hate them. So you want to portray your own ugliness in your characters. You want your characters to be real. You don't want your primary characters to simply be all goody-goody, because that's not who we are, is it, really? Now, we've got some definitions that might be worth considering. I'd like you to take a minute and just listen. Just listen. You'll probably recognize them, but you know what? I'd suggest you pay attention. Antagonist is the bad guy in a story, or more properly, the opponent of the protagonist. Antagonists don't necessarily need to be bad. In the case of The Wizard of Oz, of course, the Wicked Witch, she was bad. She was the antagonist to our Dorothy. Our Dorothy was the protagonist. Not just the primary character, but the character that the action focuses around. Okay, the story follows the protagonist. So it might be worth distinguishing between protagonist and what you might call a main character. I guess a main character might take up more space in the story, but not necessarily be the one that the story follows. Now, there are cardboard characters, literally cardboard cutouts, emotionless, valueless. You have confidant characters, the ones that the primary characters or the protagonist or anyone in the story actually confides in, tells secrets to. This is often an interesting vehicle for getting inside the psyche of characters when they have these people they call in their difficulties, etc. There's a developing character, which is, as it sounds, a character who evolves throughout the story or changes throughout the course of the story, not necessarily positively. And there's a flat character who essentially is composed or comprised of one or two traits, all right, and they don't change, and that's all there is to them. There's a foil character. Now, a foil character is one who is opposite or reflects or contrasts to the protagonist character, one who moves in a different direction, for example, or exhibits contradictory behavior or attitude to the main character. The narrator can be a character in the story, and a narrator can be either a reliable teller of the story or an unreliable teller of the story. When the narrator is I, the narrator is absolutely a concrete character in the story. But even in the third person, with the narrator telling the story, the narrator could find his or her way into the plot line. A round character is a character that is complex, perhaps even contradictory. A round character tends to be able to catch a reader off guard because we think we know these characters and we make assumptions about them, and then for one reason or another, they're able to change their minds, or they're able to function under what might appear to be contradictory moralities. Okay, they're not simple. The spear carrier is a minor character, usually found in a crowd. They are go-alongs, tag-alongs, followers of one of the primary characters. They serve to reinforce the ideas of those larger, more significant characters. Static characters are characters who do not change, and stock characters are the typical, stereotypical, perhaps even over-dramatized typical characters. The brave captain of the ship, the suicidal troubled teen, the ruthless, heartless businessman. Sympathetic characters are what they sound like. Those whose feelings a reader can comfortably identify with, as opposed to the unsympathetic characters whose motivations and feelings make the reader uncomfortable. Now, you can blend these if you have well-developed characters so that you're essentially sympathetic to a character, but there are things about that character that you don't like, or vice versa. You're essentially unsympathetic. You don't care for a character and the way that he behaves, but he or she does something endearing on occasion that catches you off guard. Those would be nicely developed characters. And the viewpoint character is essentially the character through whom we experience the story. Likely the narrator, but not always. And those are the nuts and bolts of characters. Okay, those are the different kinds you can have, and the different ways in which they can be presented. Now we're going to talk briefly about how to construct characters. A couple of methods. I've got what's called a character sketch or a character sheet that I can that I'm going to transmit to you, and that will get us on board. Props and details are essential to creating a good character. But since I can't do a very good Australian accent, I'll just leave it with the hat. Yeah, of course, you know, details and images that you can convey are important to transmitting a character. They're not all there is to characterization. Dressing up a character and painting a picture of them on the outside is only the surface, literally. A person, a character, is more than what they look like. So you can't just rely on the details of visual cues in order to create a character. You've really got to get into the character's motivations, their attitudes, their histories, their psyches. And I'm going to give you a couple of things to think about in order to help you get there. But before that, remember that what you're really trying to do is get to know your characters. And I'm going to throw at you a number of questions and techniques that are designed not so much for you to write into your stories, but to help you think about the characters that you want in your stories and how they might act when you construct a scenario or a situation in that story, so that you don't use these sheets. I suppose you could. You don't use these guidelines to directly respond in a story to a character's situation, but rather it allows you as a writer to know how your character might behave when you write a character into that situation. As I said earlier, as the Kelly article says as well, you're really not going to want to think about these things while you're writing so much as use these things in advance to get to know your characters so that while you're writing, you and your character are fairly seamless. You know what that character is going to do because you know who that character is. Anyway, first of all, things to think about, and then we'll talk about how to represent those things. There's personality. What kind of person is your character? Outgoing, introverted, star quality, superstar? We think about Mrs. Mallard in The Story of an Hour as a fairly complex character, and though we get very little, we do get enough to know that she's a free spirit at heart, and for years she repressed that spirit to the point even maybe of not being aware of its existence until it emerged and boiled over in her. Okay? That's her personality, her deep-seated personality, not the surface one, and that story conveys very effective irony by disguising the identity of that character, momentarily at least on the surface. The character's profession or training or job experience define characters. Certain people in certain fields wouldn't do what other people in other fields would do. A doctor's attitude towards a life and death struggle might be different than a welder's. Or let's put them both in a bar fight and think about how they might behave. Status is another one, that a person's social authority or social standing can carry significance in terms of what they do or how they behave or who they are. And this can change as well. Sometimes great stories have been written. I think of The Bonfire of the Vanities as one great book by Tom Wolfe that illustrates the complete devastation of a character's status and how that character responds to that. So oftentimes changes like this that the characters are confronted with also develop storylines or create storylines. This is essential to remember, that a character and a story are invested in one another. One can't happen without the other. Okay, back to the list. 4, family. All right, if a character comes from a large family as opposed to a small family, is the middle child or is an only child, these can be very important distinctions. I remember one time that when we were kids, I had two brothers and one sister, and on pizza night, my brothers and I would eat very fast because he who eats the fastest gets the most. And we were all about gluttony. So my brothers and I would eat as much as we could, as quickly as we could, and when all the pizza was gone, my sister would cry because she had only gotten one piece because she chose to relish her pizza. Now, this apparently was devastating to her because none of the boys remembered it, but she did, and she would bring it up on holidays well into our 30s and carried that resentment of her brothers for years and years and years. And don't get me wrong, I love my sister, but enough is enough. It was just a couple of pieces of pizza. But these are character-forming moments, and so thinking about a character's family history can help you to understand how that character behaves. Family wealth is another variation of that. If you're born into poverty, or if you're born into affluence, you would probably likely have different attitudes about the world. I remember my grandmother, and believe me, she was a character. She was born into or preceding the Depression era, and in the 1930s, she was a mother trying to raise 3 sons. And so for her, interesting quirks were things like if she burned a toast because they couldn't afford to buy bread and throw out old toast, she would scrape it. And she would scrape it sometimes until you could see through it, but there was no way that that toast was going to waste. And of course, you all know about the 3 squares rule of toilet paper. Yeah, 3 squares, that's right. This is Depression-era mentality. It was pervasive in people who suffered through the Depression. It's defining of a character. Major changes are essential to major differences in characters. Okay, oftentimes characters don't change unless there's some sort of dramatic change in their lives or in their beings. When you have a character who loses a loved one, or loses a leg, or gets $1 million, these are major changes. And while they're great sort of plot variations, they can also help you to define your character. Different characters in different situations would react in different ways to any and all of these major changes. So we can talk about changes in the character, him or herself, but also changes in the surroundings of that character. Fears and phobias often are great obstacles in stories to characters achieving what they want. I'm sure you've all seen movies or read books in which the character has a fear of heights but needs to go up high to save somebody or save something, or needs to overcome the fear of snakes in order to get the gold, and blah, blah, blah. These things happen all the time in stories. Quirky traits are really interesting because everybody does things that are sort of unique to them. Things that may be irritating, you know, things that may be, I don't know, original at worst, bothersome at best. If you remember the fifth Harry Potter novel, there was a particular character who would say, and he was a bothersome and irritating character, and this was a little problematic, but it was one way that a writer was able to signal to a reader something bad's going to happen. Okay? Now, I don't know if I have any of those traits, but everybody does. I'm sure if I spend a little time looking at myself, I might be able to find one. But we all have them. They can be endearing, they can be irritating. Weaknesses. Every character has weaknesses. Every person has weaknesses. We're not all just muscles and glory. So you want to keep in mind the things that are problematic for a character, okay? Mothers often have weaknesses for their children. People often have ego problems, which are weaknesses. Weaknesses can also be things that you like too much, that you love too much. Girlfriends. Love of a girlfriend can often blind a man. It doesn't happen as much with women, I'm not sure why, but men get stupid and they miss things because of the weakness of their hearts. Relationships, additionally, are great ways to consider how a character is or who a character is. You look at your character in relationships with people and with not just people inside the story, but people outside the story. Think about how your character might get along with your mother, or might get along with your daughter, or might get along with your best friend, or your worst enemy. Thinking about your characters outside of the story allows you to get a better sense of what they might be or do inside the story. Okay? And in terms of how your character might behave toward a friend, toward an enemy, toward a neighbor, allows you, again, to be better prepared for when those scenarios might occur in the story. A character's goals are essential for you as a writer to know. The primary goal of the character is the bottom line motivation for that character. It is the thing that gets that character moving forward through all of the adversity that he or she faces. It is the thing that brings the character from the beginning to the end of a story. If you don't know what motivates the character, then you cannot understand and you cannot convey to us an understanding of why it's so essential for that character to do the things he or she does. Rarely do things happen or decisions get made by a character that is beyond any sense of motivation. So understanding what drives a character is essential to knowing what a character will do. Now finally, you've got to think about what's called the hard question, okay? The hard question is, what would stop this character? What would be the end for this character? What would cause this character to give up the fight? And if you know that, then you know the character's limits. Okay? And this can tell an awful lot about a character's integrity, about a person's strength of motivation, or actual desire. Perhaps the character is telling the truth or lying to him or herself. Now, like I said, these are all things that you want to consider while you're developing your character. They're not necessarily things that you write into the story. But if you don't know this stuff about your characters, it's very difficult for you to know how your character is going to be, what your character is going to do, why. And very difficult for you to convey that to your audience, especially in a way that is going to have them interested. Character sheets are a great way for you to get to know your characters more thoroughly. And essentially, they're just lists of qualities that you can construct in order to convey to yourself a sense of who your character really is. Things that you need to know about your characters before you even start writing. For example, character's name can be very important, very powerful. While the props, like I said, resemble the characters, okay, they don't define the characters entirely. Take this issue of names, for example. Okay, do you have a certain image that comes to mind when you hear the name Marilyn or Ashley? Is Ashley a different person than Marilyn, do you think, just based on the name? What about Chip as opposed to Woody? Taylor. Let's try it with all one name. Not Taylor, but William. Okay? Or how about Willie? Bill? Billy Bob? Wheelman? Buckner? Anyway, you get the idea. Okay, characters, like I said, they can be constructed with props, but they can be constructed in a number of different ways as well. Name is important. Occupation is important as well. As I said earlier, what a character does helps to define that character's identity. The way a person is trained. Okay, take for example, Kung Fu Master as an occupation. Do you think that this person has some sort of identity that is very different, from, say, a cowboy? I would think that they would approach things differently. Although they might both have peace of mind. Those would seem to me to be very, very, very good jobs. But they would probably approach things a little differently. Other things like religion, skin tone, limps or scars, those are all interesting and effective and useful to defining a character. But they don't get at the essence of the character. Now, once you have decided on a character, you know this character and what you want that character to be, all right, be done with it. And then your job is to stick to that character as you write him or her. But the character needs to be consistent until there's a reason why that character will change. Right? Not all characters change, as I've said, but your round characters, your developing characters, your more complicated characters do tend to change. And when you come to those changes, fine. Make sure you have explanations for them. But once you've got your character, don't change him or her wholesale for the sake of the moment, and don't forget who your characters are. Consistency with the character is essential. Now, in order to gain this consistency, you need to get to know your characters. You really need to know them inside and out, and without thinking about them. There are a couple of ways to do this, okay, all outside the story that you may write. One is to have a conversation with your character, or put your character into conversation with people that you know, and see what they would say. Say, for example, you create a scenario with your character, and you're on your way to school, and your character forgot his or her books. What would she say? What would he want to do? How would they discuss it with you? Would they ask you to loan them the book? Would they ask you to drive them back, knowing that it would make you late? Knowing what your character will do in any given conversation, or what they will say in any given conversation, allows you then to use them more freely, to write more freely, knowing what your characters are going to do. And the more you have to think about that, the more mechanical your writing becomes, because it's an act of consciousness as opposed to an act of freedom. Now further, play with your characters, okay? You've got a character sheet. Why don't you put your character into a situation? What would your character do if he or she was on a blind date? What would your character do if he or she found out that his mother was dying? What would your character do if right in front of her the car burst into flames and she was faced with risking herself and saving the lives of the people in the car in front of her? What would happen? Okay? And not even such drastic things. Your character wants to go to the mall and can't find a way to get there. What's she going to do? Your character's hungry. Where's she going to go? Okay? Putting them into little scenarios allows you to discover more and more about what that character would do. And again, this is all before the rules of the character are written, so you can play around, have some fun, see what you want this character to become. Now, one of my favorites is to torture the characters. Okay? Create miserable situations for these characters and see what kind of integrity or what kind of character they really have. Put them on a roller coaster despite a fear of heights. I love to torture my wife that way. Let's see, how else do I torture my wife? I drink soda, and she's got a pet peeve about the soda bottles lying around, so I leave them lying around. I turn the heat down, and it takes hours, but finally at some point she recognizes that it's too cold. She feels a chill in her bones, and she turns the heat up, and it upsets her to no end to find out what the thermostat's been set at. But these little tortures allow me to get to know her better. Yeah, right. No, these are just examples of the way that you might torture a character. You can make it more severe. Put them in a room with a rabid dog. Anyway, further, remember that your characters need to be good and bad. Your good characters. Okay? Characters that are just one or just the other. And again, like I said, I'm talking about your primaries. Your protagonist, your antagonist, your main supporting characters. They're not just one or the other. Okay? They all have their quirks. They all have their traits. And a lot of times when you're writing a good character, the more powerful the negative trait is, the more effectively it will get your reader thinking about how they feel about this character. And these can be mild, moderate, or they can be quite severe traits. Take, for example, a good character who gets up every morning, makes a pot of coffee, and then drinks it all before his wife gets up. So she can smell it, and she knows it's coming. She gets excited. She goes downstairs, and the pot's empty. Yeah, that would be me. I do that to my wife all the time. And I justify it by saying, well, she should have got up sooner. Can't expect me to leave coffee there all day. She can make another pot for herself. Well, this kind of gives you a bad taste about me, doesn't it? Me, the character, not me, the person. Now, it can be much more severe than that. Take, for example, the man whose dog was dying, and he knew that the dog was in terrible state. It was expelling on the ground. It could no longer move. It couldn't get up to eat or drink. It was dying. It smelled bad, and it was suffering. You could hear it whining at every exhale, and that was the only thing that the dog did, was lie and whine until his breath became so shallow that there was no whining at all. And the only thing that moved were his eyes. And the man watches the dog 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days. And he knows that he should have the dog put away. He knows that the dog should be put out of his misery. And he can't do it, or he won't do it. He won't spend the money to take the dog to the vet, to kill a dog that's going to die anyway. And he can't bring himself to do the deed himself. So he just lets the dog die. Don't you wonder about that character? He's great, he's got a beautiful dog, but then this happens, and now you have to wonder. Finally, in terms of characters, as I've said earlier, the characters need to grow, the characters need to change. And most often, people change due to suffering. Okay, we do not change ourselves unless we are in enough pain that we deem it necessary to do so. Okay, and you'd be amazed if you think about it, and how much we're willing to put up with. How many of you have stayed in relationships for months or even years longer than you knew you should have because it was easier to stay and put up with the misery than it was to just get out and be the bad guy for 5 minutes? Come on, don't lie. How many? Well, not all of us have done it, but most of us, I bet, have at one point or another. Stayed rather than gone. Left things the same because comfortable and miserable is familiar, as opposed to changing. Well, keep this in mind with your characters, okay? Short of tragedy, sort of intense suffering, there's very little that's going to get a character to change his or her personality or attitude or identity. Take this amount of reality and apply it to your storytelling, okay? Now you're done. That's simple. The next step, forget everything I just said and magically apply it to your characters.